Right, well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules today to join us on our webinar as we discuss prenups, postnups, and planning ahead with our special guest, Jessica Palmer, partner and head of family at Streathers Solicitors. Our discussion will begin shortly, but before we start, just a quick disclaimer to go through for compliance before we get into it. Information presented here today is for educational purposes only and does not intend to make an offer or solicitation for the sale or purchase of any specific securities, investments, or investment strategies. Investments involve risk and, unless otherwise stated, are not guaranteed. Be sure to first consult with a qualified financial advisor and/or tax professional before implementing any strategy discussed herein. Also consult with a legal professional on any other topics that are discussed today. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to my colleague Brian and Jessica for an interesting discussion.
If we just paid attention to the disclaimers, Ruben, it makes it sound like Jessica's presenting marriage as an investment strategy, but it shouldn't be. These are the precursors and such. So from the introduction, I think we want to take our conversation with Jessica as just like the pictures behind her, like a flamingo, nice and colorful, open-minded, vibrant, fun, and we're going to express a lot of personality in this. We're going to have a lot of fun. Jessica, we know you're in the legal field. We know you help people in the marriage field. Tell us about what you do, who you help.
Yeah, so as Ruben's already said, I'm head of family at Streathers Solicitors. So I primarily work with couples who are either separating or going through a divorce, but I also work quite a lot with clients who are looking to protect their assets in the event that something goes wrong. Now, obviously, we all hope that, you know, when we get married or get into relationships, it's going to last forever, but unfortunately it doesn't always. And so it's about a bit of practical planning for the future, really. So that's what I assist clients with generally. I've been at Streathers for over 10 years now. When I started, there was no family department at all. So I joined the firm to start doing that type of work, and then it's gradually built up, and we've got a good little department going, offering sort of full service in all kind of family related matters.
What's the beginning of the process of going through a pre-marriage counseling with a lawyer? If
Yeah,
that's the terminology I can use.
I can't do counseling.
Not that kind of counseling. You are counsel, so therefore.
Yeah, so generally speaking, I would meet with someone or, you know, speak with them over the phone, get an idea of what their situation is. So generally people will approach me at one of two stages, depending on their situation. One, if they are looking to get married, a lot of people will approach me and sort of say, look, I want to understand a bit more about what implications there are for marriage, and what I can do to protect my assets, because I think a lot of people go into marriage not actually realizing the sort of legal and financial implications. Understandably so, because people are marrying because they're in love and expect it to last forever. But I think there is an increasing trend in people sort of being a little bit more concerned about what were to happen if they were to separate. And so they'll come to me. I will sort of talk them through what assets they have, talk them through what the situation would be if they were to get divorced, and then also talk to them about protecting their assets. And so if they're looking to get married, that's going to be a prenuptial agreement. Sometimes I get clients come to me and they're already married and they've perhaps received some inheritance from a family member, and so they're thinking, oh, I want to make sure that I protect that in the event that something happens. And so in that case, you can enter into what's called a postnuptial agreement. It's the same as a prenuptial agreement, but it's after you've got married. I also speak with clients who are potentially in the process of buying a property, because quite often people are only able to, particularly in London, only able to buy properties if they're getting a bit of assistance from mum or dad, using some inheritance, or they've, worked really hard to save up, and they're potentially buying with a partner who they're not married to, and they need a bit of advice in terms of protecting that interest that they've put, the money they've put into the property, or if they're purchasing the property on their own, preventing their partner being able to make claims in the future in the event that they separate. So it's sort of a variety depending on whether you're unmarried or whether you're about to get married or whether you're already married.
In other words, it's never too late.
Never too late.
Never too late for planning.
Obviously, postnuptial agreements are a trickier conversation once you're already married. But I usually find it's a trigger point, like I say, inheriting something, or, I think people are a bit more practical about things at the moment. And so you may have just got married and think, oh, actually, I am a bit concerned about everything I've built up before the marriage. I want to protect that. And so that's where a postnuptial agreement would fit in.
Absolutely. Are there other documents next to the prenup and postnup that clients should be looking at the same time?
I mean, I think it's always really important to consider wills. It's not something I do, but colleagues in my firm, I quite often work really closely to ensure that their will is, matches what we've put in the prenuptial agreement or postnuptial agreement, to avoid any disputes at a later stage. Because if you have a will that leaves someone nothing, but they would get more than that in the prenuptial agreement, you might have a problem. So that's really important. But in terms of the documentation in the event you were to get divorced, it's really the prenuptial agreement or the postnuptial agreement. It's just that those documents have to sort of fit a certain amount of criteria to be upheld by the court. So they've got to be fair and reasonable in the circumstances. They have to meet the needs of any children, and both the parties involved. Both sides have to have had independent legal advice, because the court need to be satisfied that they've signed up, they know what they're signing up to. And full financial disclosure has to be provided. So what that means is each person has to set out what their financial information, which is included within the agreement. The reason being is because the court want to know that both sides have come to it with sort of open eyes, and that they're not suddenly realizing there's £1 million stashed under the floorboard somewhere. So that's quite important if the agreement is going to be upheld, because in this country, you can't exclude the jurisdiction of the court. What that means is that on divorce, the courts still retain a level of power to decide something different to what is in the prenuptial agreement if they aren't satisfied that the criteria I just set out have been met. Most of the time, they will be upheld, provided the criteria has been met. But yeah, as I say, you can't exclude the jurisdiction. And that is something that's different in this country to, I believe, is the case in, say, France.
Interesting. So you've had a client that had £1 million stashed in their floorboards.
I haven't yet. Not one that's owned up to it anyway.
Good. Hopefully they never do own up to it.
Yeah, because if they own it up to me, then I have to disclose it. So they tend to keep quiet if they're doing that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. One reminder for any of our U.S. clients, even if you change something inside of your will, if you have qualified accounts back in the States, 401ks, 403bs, IRAs, Roths, those will have a beneficiary designated on them to avoid probate. And therefore, you want to make sure when you're reviewing any of those types of documents that you adjust those so that you don't have two conflicting documents. I think that's one of the most important things that we find when any client meets with their lawyers is re-reviewing them on a regular basis, having a regular reintroduction of the documents back to making sure that they're up to date and in line. Does that work also with a prenup or a postnup?
what, having to
review them for major changes?
I think it's always helpful to review for major changes at the point when you're looking at any kind of assets. Or do you mean reviewing the prenuptial agreement?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, would you have it? I would say the average person with a will, they should re-review it even with no major changes every 5 years.
Yeah.
That'd be typically what we'd have in our checkbook. Would you have a regular time frame that you would re-review a prenup?
Yeah, so we tend to put in review clauses that mean that you should review it on any major change of circumstances. For example, if you have a child, if one of you were to go bankrupt, possibly if one of you wins the lottery and suddenly becomes a multimillionaire, or generally, we tend to put in about a 5-year review clause. We're really careful to kind of also say, though, if it doesn't get reviewed, it still stands, because, it's not always easy to review a prenuptial agreement, as your marriage goes
I don't know
on.
if I was having a kid, I don't know if the first thing I'd think of is, Jessica, all right, let's have a phone call.
I know, exactly. So I get it, the realities of life. And so that's why when we draft them, we do try and sort of anticipate that in the future there might be kids. And so you kind of build that in. But, things change all the time, and we don't have a crystal ball in terms of what people's situations are going to be in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, 20 years' time. And so it is really important to review it. But I'm also alive to the fact that, it probably falls to the bottom of everybody's admin lists.
Perfect. What else do we need to know about your field?
Oh,
what questions have I missed, Jessica?
I suppose it's also not just about the marriage point, as I touched on earlier. I think one thing that people don't understand is when they're living with someone but they're not married, that there's sometimes a common misconception 2 ways. One is that if people have been together for a certain period of time, they have what's called a common law marriage. Very popular misconception that if you've been together a long time, that means you're in effect married, and therefore you have the rights of someone who's married. It's just at the moment not the case. Now there's a lot of discussions about whether the law will change on that, and actually there will be more rights for cohabiting couples, but as it stands now, that's not the case. And so that can be a surprise to people who, say, are 20 years into their relationship but never married. They might have kids together, and although there's some additional protection when you have kids, it very much depends on the circumstances, and it's certainly not the same as if you're married. And I think the other misconception is that you could be living with someone, own a property, and that they have no rights to it, when actually there are certain circumstances where people can claim what's called a beneficial interest in somebody else's property. And so that's where cohabitation agreements come in. It's essentially signing, saying you're living here, you're paying towards bills, but it doesn't mean you have a right to own a share of my property because I've put all the money in and it's mine effectively. So yeah, I think that's another sort of area which is becoming more and more common because less people get married.
That's interesting, having to approach somebody to say, oh, you're moving in, but you don't own my house just because you're moving in. I would have never even thought of that. That's why we have these conversations with wonderful people like you,
Yeah,
Jess.
and I think it becomes, again, it becomes more of a conversation when the money is being gifted by parents, because they tend to kind of go, well, what happens if you split up? But it also applies if someone's, worked really hard to save up lots of money prior to a relationship, and they, purchase this property, then someone else moves in, and then all of a sudden they split up and they have a right to claim in the property. Now, it's not easy to establish a beneficial interest in the property, but it is possible, and it also leads to uncertainty. So cohabitation agreement is the perfect way to kind of just set out right from the beginning, well, this is not the case. it sets out their intentions effectively.
Absolutely. No, I like that. Yeah, all of these are different rules per country. You know, cohabitation rights totally different in common law countries.
Yeah.
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
in civil law countries.
Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, I suppose for anyone living in London, if they're buying a property over here, then English cohabitation rights are going to apply, and so it is really relevant, even if you're from the US living over here or any other jurisdiction living over here, because you just may not be aware of that.
Absolutely. Oh, this is brilliant. Ruben, do we want to open it up to the audience for any questions that we should be asking Jessica?
Absolutely. I posted a note in the chat, so we'll just see if any questions come through from our attendees.
And Jessica, any other things that we should have asked you?
I suppose just another point back on the unmarried couples is also if you're buying a property together, this comes up quite a lot actually. People buy a property together, unmarried, and they put in different amounts to the deposit. Now, quite often people just sort of go, okay, well, we're just going to own it jointly. But actually, when it comes to a point, if they separate, they very rarely want to accept that they own it jointly. And they say, well, okay, but I want more out of the property because I put more into it. And so in those circumstances, what they would need is what's called a declaration of trust. It's essentially setting out that they own the property in different shares. And so there's a variety of different ways that can be done, whether it's fixed amounts they're protecting or whether it's sort of depends on financial contributions over time. There's various different ways, but it's really important because the amount of people we get who come to us and say, I've separated, I want more of the property because I put more in. And you say, well, did you get a declaration of trust at the time you purchased? And they say no. And that's a real problem because then the assumption is they just own it jointly. And so that's just another area where increasingly we're seeing sort of difficulties arise on separation because there's been no planning at the outset, which again, I understand, but yeah.
Also, if one of the two partners wanted to buy the interest of the other, how do you define the actual price if it's not preset?
So I would normally suggest there's two ways really. You either agree to jointly appoint a valuer.
Okay.
So a RICS appointed valuer, the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors. They do a valuation, or you get 3 estate agent valuations and take an average of the 3. But again, that can be built into a declaration of trust, which sets out that's how it should be determined and sets out, the option for one to buy the other out.
In other words, the planning is the key.
Planning is so important, and no one knows how their life is going to change, what circumstance would have changed. Children will have an impact on it, but not only is it good for protecting your assets, actually planning at the outset, as unromantic as it may seem, actually avoids a lot of arguments if you do separate, because most of the time arguments are caused by different understandings of what would happen, different recollections of what would happen. And so generally speaking, if you've got something there in black and white, which sets out what your intentions were at the time, and you have practical conversations about it, then generally speaking, it leads to a much more amicable separation or divorce. And so, yeah, as I say, as unromantic as it seems, it is really important.
It makes those tough conversations make for a better relationship over the course of time. If you can have those tough conversations, the easy conversations are easy.
Yeah. So, and if you treat it like, I don't know, financial planning or, wills, inheritance, considering all of that, it's just part of good, I suppose, good financial planning in a way. And just having those conversations at the outset when you are in a good place rather than trying to have them when you're in not such a good place.
I know as a lot of our clients, financial planners, we will tell somebody when they're getting married, you need to talk to somebody like Jessica because it's just the right thing to do, and come back to us with any questions, which makes it easier for them to go up to their spouse or their future spouse
Yeah.
and say, Brian's being a jerk and he really wants me to get this document.
Yeah.
He tells me it changes the awkwardness of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I always tell clients to blame me for things, but also quite often, one thing people I've found do is blame their parents. So quite often it's about protecting inheritance, and usually it's at the instigation of parents who are sort of saying, well, we want to leave you this, but, or we want to gift you this now, but, and so again, it becomes more of a practical conversation rather than an emotional one. And yeah, as I say, it is just good financial planning.
Absolutely. I could not agree more. Jessica, this is extremely helpful. How can everybody get a hold of you if they have questions or if they would like to set up a consultation with you?
So you can just get in touch with me via my email, which is jpalmer, PALMER, @streathers.co.uk. You can go on the Streathers website, which will also have my details on. So if you Google Streathers Family Law, then we will come up, and contact details are on there. If anyone needs any advice, then what I normally do is I'll normally sort of have an initial call with them to have a chat, get an idea of their circumstances. And then if more in-depth advice is needed, then we usually arrange a sort of more thorough meeting. But yeah, always happy to sort of pick up the phone and speak to someone and give them a bit of guidance. If I'm not around, then I've got a team of people who can assist as well.
Brilliant. We always like to leave these. Yes, the meeting will be recorded and it will be set up on our YouTube. So don't worry, we'll send out a follow-up email for everybody with exactly how to access that. That was one of our other questions right in there. Jessica, I always like to leave on one important question. Here in London, the gastronomic capital of the world, what is your favorite English food?
Favorite English food?
Doesn't have to be English. It can be favorite food in England.
That is a tricky one. I think, and it's certainly not English food, but I think for me, it's. I don't know if you've been to Dishoom.
Absolutely.
Is one of my favorite places to go. The Black Dal. There's just, for me, it's so rich and you can't eat loads of it, but for me it is, the epitome of good taste.
You're making me miss our old office. It was right next to a Dishoom.
Was it? Oh
yeah, it is wonderful. That is a good pick and good inspiration. I'll have to make it down there. Jessica, thank you so much for taking the time. For everybody that's thinking about going into a marriage or a partnership, she is definitely a must to talk to make sure you have everything in order. Please send her all your questions or come to us and we'll help introduce you over just right.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Brian. Yeah, and if anybody has questions, then just get in touch.
Have a great day, Jessica. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Wonderful. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.